When tech mogul Marcus Thompson discovered his housekeeper Sarah Chen crouched in his walk-in closet with his 4-year-old son, Tommy clutched tightly in her arms, both of them trembling with fear, he thought he had walked into his worst nightmare. But when he learned the truth about why she was hiding there, it shattered every wall he had built around his heart and changed the course of 3 lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., cutting through the darkness of Sarah Chen's cramped studio apartment like a knife through silence. She rolled over on the thin mattress that served as her bed, her body aching from another sleepless night spent worrying about bills, about her younger brother David's medical expenses, about whether she could keep their small world from completely falling apart. At 28, Sarah had already lived several lifetimes' worth of hardship. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19, leaving her to raise David, who was only 12 at the time. What should have been her college years, her time to dream and explore and discover who she might become, had instead been consumed by the relentless demands of survival. She worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night when she was lucky, and had learned to stretch $1 until it screamed for mercy. The studio apartment in Queens was barely larger than some people's closets, but it was what she could afford. A Murphy bed that she folded up each morning, a tiny kitchenette with a refrigerator that wheezed and complained, a bathroom so small she had to step into the hallway to fully open the door. The walls were thin enough that she could hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door arguing with her television every night, and the radiator clanged like a percussion section that had forgotten how to keep time. But it was theirs, it was home, and Sarah had fought tooth and nail to keep it. David was 21 now, studying pre-med at a community college while working nights at a grocery store. He was brilliant, the kind of mind that could memorize entire textbooks and solve complex equations in his head, but his dreams of becoming a doctor seemed impossibly far away when they were constantly one crisis away from losing everything. Last month, he had needed emergency surgery for appendicitis, and even with their basic insurance, the medical bills had arrived like a flood that threatened to drown them both. Sarah pulled herself out of bed, her joints protesting every movement. She had been cleaning houses and offices for almost a decade now, and her body bore the evidence of countless hours spent on her knees scrubbing floors, reaching into corners, lifting and moving and bending until her spine felt like it might snap. Her hands were permanently dry and cracked from cleaning chemicals, her shoulders permanently hunched from the weight of carrying supply buckets and vacuum cleaners up and down stairs. She made instant coffee with water heated in the microwave, standing at the small window that looked out over the fire escape and the brick wall of the building next door. In the distance, she could see the glittering skyline of Manhattan, a world that might as well have been on another planet for all the connection she felt to it. Those towers of glass and steel housed the wealthy, the powerful, the people who could solve their problems with money, the way she solved hers with pure stubborn determination and 18-hour workdays. The shower lasted exactly 3 minutes, a habit born from years of trying to keep the utility bills as low as possible. She dressed in her standard uniform, dark jeans, a plain white t-shirt, comfortable sneakers that had seen better days, but still had enough soul left to carry her through another day of manual labor. Her long black hair went into a practical ponytail, and she applied just enough makeup to look presentable. Not because she cared about impressing anyone, but because she had learned that people trusted their homes to cleaners who looked neat and professional. The subway ride into Manhattan took an hour, and Sarah used every minute to review her schedule. Mondays and Thursdays, she cleaned for the Hendersons, an elderly couple on the Upper West Side, who paid her well and always left out homemade cookies. Tuesdays and Fridays belonged to the law firm of Brennan and Associates, where she emptied trash cans and scrubbed conference room tables after meetings that probably involved more money than she would see in her lifetime. Wednesdays were for smaller clients, individual apartments and townhouses scattered across the city. And then there were Saturdays. Saturdays belonged to Marcus Thompson. She had been working for him for 8 months now, ever since answering an ad that had seemed almost too good to be true. The pay was exceptional, more than she made from all her other clients combined for just 1 day of work per week. The catch, she had assumed, would reveal itself eventually. There was always a catch when something seemed too generous, too easy. But 8 months in, the only catch seemed to be Marcus Thompson himself. He was, without question, the most difficult person she had ever worked for, and that was saying something in a career that had brought her into contact with demanding socialites, perfectionist lawyers, and at least 3 people who seemed to believe that their housekeepers possessed supernatural powers to make problems disappear. Marcus Thompson was different, though. His difficulty wasn't born from entitlement or laziness, or the casual cruelty that sometimes came with having too much money. His difficulty came from something deeper, something that sat in his chest like a stone and colored every interaction with a gray wash of barely controlled anger and grief. He was 35 years old and looked like he hadn't slept properly in years. Tall and lean with dark hair that was always slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it in frustration. He wore expensive suits that hung on his frame, like they belonged to someone else, someone who cared about appearances and impressions, and all the small social contracts that kept the world of the wealthy functioning smoothly. His penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side was a monument to success and isolation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Central Park and the Manhattan skyline. The furniture was modern and expensive, all clean lines and neutral colors, the kind of carefully curated space that appeared in design magazines. Everything was perfectly arranged, perfectly clean, perfectly lifeless. It was a space that had been designed to impress, not to comfort. There were no family photos, no personal touches, no signs that anyone actually lived there and found joy in the living. The kitchen looked like it had never been used for anything more complicated than reheating takeout. The dining room table was covered with stacks of business documents and laptop computers. The living room felt like a waiting area in an expensive office building. And then there was Tommy. Tommy Thompson was 4 years old, with his father's dark hair and eyes that held far too much sadness for someone so young. He was a beautiful child, the kind that would have been the star of any playground or preschool class, but there was something fragile about him, something that suggested he had already learned that the world was not a particularly safe or welcoming place. Sarah had learned the basic facts from Marcus during her first week on the job, delivered in the clipped, emotionless tone he used for everything from business calls to conversations about the weather. Tommy's mother, Marcus's wife Elena, had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. Since then it had been just the two of them, father and son, trying to navigate a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty and too full of sharp edges that could cut you when you weren't paying attention. Marcus worked constantly, traveling for business several days each week, staying late at the office even when he was in town. Tommy spent his days with a rotating cast of nannies and babysitters, women who came and went with such frequency that Sarah had stopped trying to learn their names. They never lasted long, and she had begun to suspect that the problem wasn't with the caregivers themselves, but with a little boy who had learned that everyone eventually left, and a father who had forgotten how to connect with the son who reminded him every day of everything he had lost. During her Saturdays at the penthouse, Sarah often found herself watching the two of them together, and what she saw broke her heart in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Marcus would come home from whatever urgent business matter had demanded his attention, and Tommy would look up with hope and expectation that dimmed a little more each time his father simply nodded in acknowledgement and disappeared into his home office. Tommy would knock on the office door, clutching a drawing or a toy he wanted to share, and Marcus would emerge just long enough to pat the boy's head absently and promise they would talk later. Later, always later. The child was hungry for attention, for connection, for some sign that he mattered to the one person he had left in the world, And Marcus was drowning in his own grief and guilt, working 18-hour days not because the business demanded it, but because the alternative was sitting still long enough for the pain to catch up with him. Sarah had grown up without much, but she had grown up with love. Even after her parents died, even during the hardest years when she was barely keeping herself and David afloat, they had been a team. They talked to each other, leaned on each other, found ways to laugh even when everything seemed impossible. Watching Marcus and Tommy exist in the same space without really seeing each other was like watching two people slowly starve to death while sitting at a table full of food. But it wasn't her place to comment. She was the housekeeper. She cleaned the apartment, did the laundry, organized the chaos that accumulated when someone was too busy and too overwhelmed to maintain the basic rhythms of domestic life. She was paid to be invisible, to maintain the smooth functioning of a household without adding any complications or opinions or emotional labor to an already difficult situation. Except that Tommy had other ideas. It had started small, the way most important things do. During her second week on the job, she had been cleaning the living room when Tommy appeared beside her, dragging a stuffed elephant that had seen better days. "What's your name?" he had asked, settling cross-legged on the floor next to her supply bucket. "Sarah," she had answered, continuing to dust the coffee table while keeping one eye on the child. "I'm Tommy, that's Mr. Peanuts." He held up the elephant, whose gray fur had been loved into a state of permanent dishevelment. "He used to be my mom's when she was little." Sarah had paused in her dusting, looking down at the boy who was watching her with the kind of intense curiosity that only children possessed. "He looks very special, he is. He knows all the best hiding places." Tommy had leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Want to see?" Before Sarah could respond, Tommy had scrambled to his feet and beckoned for her to follow. She had glanced toward Marcus's closed office door, where the sound of a conference call drifted through the heavy wood, and made a decision that would change everything. "Just for a minute," she had said, setting down her cleaning supplies. Tommy had led her to his bedroom, a space that was the only part of the apartment that felt like it belonged to an actual child. The walls were painted a cheerful blue, and there were toys scattered across the floor, picture books stacked on the nightstand, a collection of stuffed animals arranged on the bed. It should have been a happy room, but there was something sad about it too, something that suggested all those toys and books and decorations were trying very hard to compensate for something that couldn't be bought or arranged or organized into existence. "Look," Tommy had said, opening the closet door and pointing to a small space behind the hanging clothes. "Mr. Peanuts and I come here when things get scary." Sarah had knelt down to peer into the closet, and her heart had clenched at what she saw. Someone, probably Tommy himself, had arranged a small nest in the back corner. A pillow, a blanket, a flashlight, a few books. It was a hiding place, a refuge, the kind of space that children created when the world felt too big and too overwhelming, and they needed somewhere small and safe to disappear. "It's very cozy," she had said carefully. "Do you come here often?" Tommy had nodded, settling into the space with practiced ease. "When Daddy has his loud phone calls, or when the babysitters get mad, or when I miss Mommy too much and it makes my chest hurt." And there it was, the truth that everyone in that apartment had been dancing around for 2 years. This little boy was drowning in grief and loneliness, and the adults in his life were either too overwhelmed to notice or too temporary to care. He had created his own small sanctuary in the back of a closet, because nowhere else felt safe enough to hold his pain. "Mr. Peanuts is very lucky to have such a good friend," Sarah had said, and Tommy had smiled for the first time since she had started working there. That had been the beginning. Week by week, Saturday by Saturday, she had found herself spending more and more time talking with Tommy while she worked. He would follow her from room to room, chattering about his dreams, his fears, his questions about why Mommy sometimes went away and never came back. He helped her dust, standing on his tiptoes to reach the lower shelves while she handled the higher ones. He sorted socks while she folded laundry, creating elaborate organizational systems that made perfect sense to a 4-year-old mind. And slowly, carefully, she had begun to understand the shape of the crisis that was unfolding in that beautiful, sterile apartment. Marcus wasn't a bad father. He wasn't cruel or neglectful in any obvious way. He made sure Tommy had food and clothes and medical care and educational opportunities. He hired qualified caregivers and enrolled the boy in preschool programs and bought him every toy or book or electronic device that might spark his interest. But he had forgotten, or perhaps never learned, that children needed more than provision. They needed presence. They needed to feel seen and heard and valued for who they were, not just cared for as an obligation or a responsibility. Tommy was withering under the weight of his father's emotional absence, becoming quieter and more withdrawn each week, retreating more and more often to his nest in the closet, where the world felt manageable and safe. Sarah had tried, gently and carefully, to bridge the gap between them. When Marcus came home early one Saturday, she had suggested that Tommy show his father the elaborate block castle they had built together. When Tommy drew pictures of dinosaurs and spaceships and houses with families standing in front of them, she left them on Marcus's desk where he couldn't miss them. When the boy asked questions about his father's work, or expressed interest in the business calls and meetings that consumed so much of Marcus's time, she mentioned it in passing, hoping to plant seeds that might grow into actual conversations. But Marcus seemed incapable of seeing what was right in front of him. He would glance at Tommy's drawings and nod absently before shuffling them into a pile with his business documents. He would listen to reports about his son's day with the same detached attention he brought to quarterly earnings reports. He was present in body, but absent in every way that mattered, and Tommy was learning to stop hoping for anything different. The breaking point came on a Saturday in late October, when the leaves in Central Park were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and the air carried the first real bite of approaching winter. Sarah arrived at the penthouse that morning to find Tommy's latest babysitter, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, gathering her belongings with tight-lipped efficiency. "Where's Tommy?" Sarah asked, setting down her supply bucket and looking around the unusually quiet apartment. "In his room," Mrs. Patterson replied without looking up. "Mr. Thompson will need to find someone else. I don't work with children who have behavioral problems." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "What kind of behavioral problems?" Mrs. Patterson straightened, her mouth set in a hard line. "The boy is manipulative and attention-seeking. He deliberately disrupted my phone conversation with my sister by throwing toys and making noise. When I corrected him, he had a complete meltdown and locked himself in the closet. I don't have time for that kind of nonsense." The woman left without another word, and Sarah stood in the sudden silence, trying to process what she had just heard.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Tommy, manipulative. The child she knew was gentle and thoughtful, perhaps too mature for his age in some ways, old enough to understand that the adults in his life were struggling with something too big for him to fix. Attention-seeking? Of course he was. He was 4 years old and had lost his mother and was watching his father disappear into work and grief. Seeking attention was exactly what he should be doing. She found Marcus in his office, already dressed in a crisp suit despite the early hour, surrounded by the familiar chaos of documents and laptops and coffee cups that suggested he had been working since before dawn. "Mrs. Patterson said there was an incident," she said from the doorway, not wanting to intrude but needing to understand what had happened. Marcus looked up, and for a moment she saw something raw and exhausted in his expression before the professional mask slid back into place. She said Tommy was disruptive. "I've already called the agency for a replacement." What exactly happened? I don't know. I was on a conference call with Tokyo, some kind of tantrum apparently. He was already turning back to his computer, the conversation clearly over in his mind, but Sarah didn't move. Marcus, when was the last time you actually talked to your son? The question hung in the air between them, and she saw his shoulders tense. When he looked up again, there was something dangerous in his expression, a warning that she was stepping over lines that should not be crossed. I talked to Tommy every day. I mean really talked to him. Not just asked if he brushed his teeth or told him to quiet down during your phone calls. When did you last sit with him and ask him how he's feeling, or what he's thinking about, or what he did at school? Marcus stood slowly, and Sarah realized she had made a serious mistake. This man was her employer, not her friend. He paid her to clean his apartment, not to offer unsolicited parenting advice. But it was too late to take the words back, and honestly she wasn't sure she would have even if she could. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "you are here to maintain my household, not to analyze my relationship with my son. If you're not comfortable with the boundaries of your employment, I can certainly find someone who is." The threat was clear, and Sarah felt her stomach drop. She needed this job. David's medical bills were still mounting, their rent was due in 2 weeks, and finding another client who paid as well as Marcus would be nearly impossible. But as she stood there looking at this man, who was slowly destroying his relationship with his child through sheer emotional unavailability, she found that she couldn't back down. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's not my place to comment on your parenting, but someone needs to, because your son is disappearing right in front of you, and you're so busy running from your own grief that you can't see it." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at her with an expression she couldn't read, and Sarah prepared herself to be fired on the spot. She was already mentally calculating how long their savings would last, what other jobs she might be able to find, whether she could pick up extra shifts at the cleaning company to compensate for the lost income. But instead of firing her, Marcus simply turned back to his computer and said, "Tommy is in his room. Please see that he stays quiet until the replacement babysitter arrives." Sarah nodded and left the office, her hands shaking slightly as she made her way down the hall to Tommy's bedroom. She found the door closed, and when she knocked softly, there was no answer. "Tommy, it's Sarah. Can I come in?" Still no response. She tried the handle and found it unlocked, pushing the door open to reveal an empty room. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. Where was he? Had he somehow left the apartment? Was he hiding somewhere else in the penthouse? And then she heard it, a small muffled sound coming from the closet. She crossed the room and opened the closet door, and her heart broke at what she found. Tommy was curled up in his nest behind the clothes, but this time was different. This time he wasn't just hiding. He was sobbing with the kind of desperate, broken grief that she had only ever heard from adults who had lost everything. His small body shook with the force of his tears, and Mr. Peanuts lay forgotten beside him. "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, and without thinking she crawled into the closet beside him. The space was cramped, barely big enough for one child, let alone a child and a grown woman, but she managed to fit herself into the corner and gather Tommy into her arms. He clung to her like a drowning person clinging to a life preserver, his tears soaking through her t-shirt as he finally let out all the pain and confusion and loneliness he had been carrying. "She was mean," he hiccuped against her shoulder. "I was just trying to ask her if she wanted to see my new book, and she yelled at me and said I was a bad boy. And then Daddy said I was too loud and I needed to be quiet, and I tried to be quiet, but I was sad about Mommy, and when I'm sad about Mommy, sometimes I make noises even when I don't mean to." Sarah held him tighter, rocking slightly in the confined space. "You're not a bad boy, Tommy. You're a wonderful boy who misses his mommy, and that's completely normal and okay. But Daddy doesn't want me to be sad about Mommy. He gets angry when I talk about her or when I cry. So I come here where I can be sad without making him mad. And there it was, the terrible truth that explained everything. Marcus wasn't just grieving his wife, he was running from his grief so hard and so fast that he couldn't tolerate any reminders of what he had lost, including his own son's natural need to mourn his mother. "Your daddy isn't angry at you for being sad," Sarah said carefully. "I think your daddy is very sad too, and sometimes when grown-ups are sad, they forget how to show love in the right way." "Do you think he still loves me?" Tommy asked in a small voice. "Sometimes I think maybe he wishes I went away with Mommy so he wouldn't have to remember." Sarah felt tears prick her own eyes. How could Marcus not see what his emotional distance was doing to this child? How could he not understand that his son needed him now more than ever? "Your daddy loves you more than anything in the whole world," she said firmly. "Sometimes love gets scared and hides, just like you hide in here when things get overwhelming. But it's always there even when it's hiding." They sat together in the closet for a long time, Tommy's sobs gradually subsiding into hiccups, and then into the quiet breathing of exhaustion. Sarah told him stories about her own childhood, about her brother David and the games they used to play when they were scared or sad. She talked about her parents and how much she missed them, how it was okay to feel sad about people you loved who weren't there anymore. And slowly Tommy began to relax in her arms. His grip on her shirt loosened, his breathing evened out, and she realized he had fallen asleep against her shoulder. She should have woken him up, carried him to his bed, gone back to her cleaning duties. That would have been the professional thing to do, the appropriate thing. But something held her in that cramped closet with this broken little boy in her arms. Maybe it was the knowledge that this might be the safest he had felt in months. Maybe it was her own recognition of what it felt like to carry too much weight at too young an age. Or maybe it was just the simple human instinct to protect something precious and fragile. Whatever it was, she stayed. She sat in Tommy's hiding place, holding him while he slept, and thought about the impossible situation they were all trapped in. Marcus was drowning in his own grief and taking his son down with him. Tommy was learning that love was something unreliable, something that could disappear without warning and leave you alone with your pain. And she was just the housekeeper, paid to clean and organize but not to interfere, watching a family destroy itself through their inability to reach for each other. When Tommy finally stirred awake an hour later, he looked up at her with eyes that were red from crying but clearer than she had seen them in weeks. "Sarah," he said quietly, "will you stay here with me, just for today? I promise I'll be good and quiet, and I won't bother Daddy with his important work." Looking down at this child who was trying so hard to be perfect, to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible in his own home, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. "I'll stay," she said. "And Tommy, you don't have to be good and quiet, you just have to be yourself." Outside the closet she could hear the sounds of the apartment continuing its normal rhythms. Marcus on another conference call, the coffee maker brewing his fourth cup of the morning, the distant hum of traffic from the street far below. It was a world that moved at the speed of business and ambition, and the relentless pursuit of success. But inside the closet, time moved differently. It moved at the speed of a child's healing, at the pace of trust being rebuilt one careful breath at a time. And for the first time since she had started working in that penthouse, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. She didn't know that in a few hours, Marcus would come looking for his son and find them both curled up together in that small secret space. She didn't know that the sight of his child finally looking peaceful in the arms of someone who truly saw him would crack something open in his chest that he had been trying to keep sealed shut for 2 years. All she knew was that Tommy had asked her to stay, and every instinct she possessed told her that this little boy had been waiting far too long for someone to say yes. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the penthouse floor when Marcus finally emerged from his office, his head pounding from hours of back-to-back conference calls and his shoulders tight with tension. The Tokyo deal was falling apart, the investors were getting nervous, and he had 3 more calls scheduled before the day ended. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a nagging worry had been growing stronger with each passing hour. It was too quiet. In the 8 months since Sarah had been working for him, he had grown accustomed to the subtle sounds of her presence in the apartment. The soft swish of a vacuum cleaner, the quiet clink of dishes being organized, the gentle hum she sometimes made while working. More than that, he had grown used to the sounds of Tommy's interaction with her. Laughter, conversation, the excited patter of small feet following her from room to room. But for the past 3 hours, there had been nothing, no voices, no movement, no signs of life beyond his office walls. He walked through the living room, noting absently that it looked exactly as it had that morning. No toys scattered across the floor, no evidence that a 4-year-old had spent any time there. The kitchen was similarly untouched, Sarah's cleaning supplies sitting exactly where she had left them hours earlier. A cold unease began to settle in his stomach. "Sarah," he called out, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Tommy." No response. Marcus quickened his pace, checking the guest bathroom, the dining room, his own bedroom. Empty, all of them. The unease was transforming into something sharper now, something that made his pulse quicken and his breathing shallow. Where were they? Had something happened? Had Sarah taken Tommy somewhere without permission? Had there been an emergency? He reached Tommy's bedroom and found the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he stepped inside and called again, louder this time. "Tommy, are you in here?" The room appeared empty, afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the scattered toys and picture books that were Tommy's few claims to ownership in this sterile apartment. But there was something else, something that made Marcus pause and listen more carefully. A soft murmur, barely audible, coming from somewhere inside the room. He followed the sound, his expensive dress shoes silent on the thick carpet, until he reached the closet door. It was open just a crack, and through the gap, he could see a faint glow. Flashlight. His confusion deepened as he grasped the handle and pulled the door fully open. What he saw made his world tilt on its axis.
There, in the back corner of his son's closet, behind the hanging clothes and barely visible in the dim space, were Sarah and Tommy. The little boy was curled up in her lap, his head resting on her shoulder, his eyes closed in peaceful sleep. Sarah's arms were wrapped protectively around him, and she was humming something soft and melodic, a sound so tender and nurturing that it hit Marcus like a physical blow. They looked like a mother and child. They looked like family. They looked like everything he had lost and everything he had failed to become. For a long moment, Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. His son, who cried constantly and fought sleep and seemed perpetually agitated, was completely relaxed in the arms of their housekeeper. His son, who had stopped coming to him for comfort months ago, had found solace in a cramped closet with a woman who was paid to clean their floors. "What the hell is going on?" The words exploded out of him before he could stop them, rough and loud in the quiet space. Sarah's eyes snapped open, and he saw fear flash across her face before she carefully shifted Tommy, so she could look at Marcus directly. The little boy stirred but didn't wake, merely nestling deeper into Sarah's embrace with a small sigh of contentment. "He was upset," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the obvious alarm in her eyes. "Mrs. Patterson left rather abruptly, and Tommy needed comfort. So you decided to hide in a closet with him." Marcus could hear the anger in his own voice, but underneath it was something else, something that felt dangerously close to panic. "Do you have any idea how this looks? Do you understand the position you've put me in?" Sarah's expression shifted, and for a moment he saw something fierce flash in her dark eyes. "The position I've put you in. Mr. Thompson, your son was sobbing in this closet because he's learned that nowhere else in this apartment feels safe enough for him to express his emotions." "That's ridiculous."
Tommy has his own room, his own space where he's told to be quiet because you have important phone calls. His own space where babysitters yell at him for being a normal 4-year-old child. His own space where he's learned that missing his mother is somehow disruptive to your life. Marcus felt heat rise in his face. How dare she? How dare this woman, who was nothing more than hired help, presume to lecture him about his own son? You don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea what it's like to lose someone you love, to watch a child struggle with grief, to feel responsible for keeping a family together when everything is falling apart. Sarah's voice remained quiet, but there was steel underneath it now. Actually, Mr. Thompson, I know exactly what that's like. Something in her tone made Marcus pause, made him really look at her for the first time since he had discovered them in the closet. There was pain in her face, old and deep, the kind that came from experience rather than imagination. There was also determination, the fierce protectiveness of someone who had fought to keep something precious intact. Tommy comes here when he needs to feel safe, Sarah continued, one hand gently stroking the sleeping child's hair. He's created this space because everywhere else in his world feels unpredictable. He never knows when the next babysitter will quit, when you'll have to travel for business, when someone will tell him he's too loud or too emotional, or too much trouble. I provide everything he needs. You provide everything except the one thing he needs most. Sarah's eyes met his unflinching. The word hit him like a slap. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, something he had been working very hard to keep sealed shut for 2 years. Because she was right, wasn't she? When was the last time he had sat with Tommy without a laptop nearby? When was the last time he had asked his son about his dreams or his fears or what made him happy? When was the last time he had really seen Tommy as anything other than a responsibility to be managed, a reminder of everything he had lost? You don't understand, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. Every time I look at him, I see Elena. Every time he laughs, every time he cries, every time he asks me a question about why Mommy had to go away, it's like losing her all over again. So you choose not to look at him at all. The truth of it was so stark, so undeniable, that Marcus felt his knees weaken. He gripped the doorframe for support, staring at his son sleeping peacefully in another woman's arms, and for the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to really see what his grief had cost them both. Tommy looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile. When had his face gotten so thin? When had those dark circles appeared under his eyes? When had his son started looking like a child who carried too much weight, too much sadness, too much understanding that the world was not a safe place? He talks about you constantly, Sarah said softly. Did you know that? He tells me about the things you used to do together before Mommy died, the stories you used to read, the games you used to play. He remembers building block castles with you and riding on your shoulders, and the way you used to make funny voices when you read his bedtime stories. Marcus closed his eyes, memories washing over him like a tide. Tommy at 2 years old, giggling as Marcus chased him around the apartment making monster noises. Tommy at 3, insisting that Daddy read just one more story before bed. Tommy curled up between him and Elena on Sunday mornings, the 3 of them lazy and content in their family bed. He thinks you don't love him anymore, Sarah continued, and the words were like knives in his chest. He thinks maybe you wish he had gone away with Mommy so you wouldn't have to be reminded of what you lost. No. The word came out as a broken whisper. No, that's not. I love him more than life itself. He's all I have left of her. Then why does he spend his afternoons hiding in a closet, crying for a mother who's never coming back, and afraid to bother a father who's never really there? Marcus opened his eyes and looked at Sarah, this woman who had somehow seen his son more clearly in 8 months than he had in 2 years. She wasn't angry anymore, just infinitely sad, holding his child with a tenderness that made his throat close up. I don't know how to do this without her, he whispered. Elena was the heart of everything, She knew how to comfort him when he had nightmares, how to make him laugh when he was sad, how to explain things in ways he could understand. "I'm just the guy who paid for things, who fixed problems, who handled the practical stuff. I don't know how to be what he needs." "He doesn't need you to be Elena," Sarah said gently. "He needs you to be his father. But what if I get it wrong? What if I mess him up even more than I already have? What if I let him down the way I let her down?" "How did you let Elena down?" The question surprised him. "I should have been in the car that night. We were supposed to go to dinner together, but I had a conference call that ran late. She went alone because I was too busy with work to keep a simple dinner date with my wife." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Mr. Thompson, you can't live your life making decisions based on guilt over something that was never your fault. Elena wouldn't want that for you, and she certainly wouldn't want it for Tommy. You didn't know her. You don't know what she would want. You're right. I didn't know her. But I know Tommy, and he talks about his mother constantly. He tells me about how she used to sing to him, how she used to make pancakes in funny shapes, how she used to dance with him in the kitchen. And you know what? In every single story he tells, you're there too. You weren't just the guy who paid for things, Mr. Thompson. You were part of a family, part of a team. And Tommy remembers that version of his father." Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time in months. "I don't know how to get back to being that person. You start by showing up. You start by sitting with your son when he's sad instead of sending in a babysitter to manage the inconvenience. You start by remembering that he lost his mother too, and he's been trying to figure out how to grieve while also trying not to lose his father." In Sarah's arms, Tommy stirred slightly, making a small sound of contentment before settling back into sleep. Marcus watched his son's face, peaceful in a way he hadn't seen in months, and felt something shift inside his chest. "Why does he feel safe with you?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing the anger. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I listen to him. Because I don't try to fix his sadness or make it go away. Because I let him talk about his mother without changing the subject or telling him it's time to move on. Because I understand that sometimes hiding in a small, quiet space is exactly what you need to do to survive another day." "You lost someone too." It wasn't a question, and Sarah nodded slowly. "My parents when I was 19, car accident, just like Tommy's mother. I was left to raise my younger brother, and for a long time, I thought I was failing him because I couldn't stop being sad. I thought I had to choose between grieving my parents and taking care of David, like I couldn't do both at the same time." "How did you figure it out?" "I learned that grief doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It just gets bigger and more destructive. The only way through it is through it, and children are actually much better at that than adults are, if we let them be." Marcus looked at Tommy again, this little boy who had been trying to navigate loss and change and abandonment with the emotional resources of a 4-year-old. How had he not seen it? How had he been so consumed with his own pain that he had missed his son's? "I fired Mrs. Patterson this morning," he said quietly. "I know, Tommy told me. He said she called him manipulative." Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "She said he was attention-seeking when he tried to talk to her while she was on the phone. She told him he was a bad boy for having feelings." Jesus. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, feeling sick. "How many people have I let treat my son like he's a problem to be solved instead of a child who's been through trauma? It doesn't matter how many. What matters is what you do now." Tommy shifted again in Sarah's arms, this time opening his eyes slowly. For a moment he looked confused, blinking in the dim light of the closet. Then he saw his father standing in the doorway, and Marcus watched his son's face cycle through a series of emotions: surprise, worry, fear, and finally, resignation. "Hi, Daddy," Tommy said quietly, making no move to leave Sarah's embrace. "Are you mad at me for being in here?" The question broke Marcus's heart.
His 4-year-old son was asking permission to exist in his own home, apologizing for seeking comfort, worried about being too much trouble for the adults in his life.
"Nobody," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not mad at you. Can I come sit with you?" Tommy looked uncertain, glancing between his father and Sarah, as if trying to gauge whether this was safe. Sarah gave him an encouraging nod, and Tommy finally nodded too, scooting over slightly to make room in the small space. Marcus had to crouch down and fold himself awkwardly to fit into the closet, but he managed to settle beside them, his back against the wall, his long legs bent uncomfortably in the cramped quarters. It was the closest he had been to his son in months, close enough to see the faint freckles across Tommy's nose, close enough to smell the baby shampoo in his hair. "Mr. Peanuts is here too," Tommy said softly, picking up the stuffed elephant and holding it out for his father to see. "He gets scared sometimes, just like me." Marcus took the worn toy carefully, remembering suddenly how Elena had carried it everywhere when she was pregnant, how she had told him stories about the adventures she and Mr. Peanuts had shared as a child. He hadn't seen the elephant in months, hadn't realized Tommy still slept with it every night. "Mr. Peanuts belonged to Mommy when she was little," Marcus said, and Tommy's eyes widened with surprise. "Really? Mommy told me he was special, but I didn't know he was hers first. She used to take him everywhere. Your grandma used to tell me that Elena wouldn't go anywhere without Mr. Peanuts, not to the grocery store or to visit friends or even just to the backyard to play." Tommy's face lit up with interest, and Marcus realized this was the first time in months that they had talked about Elena without him changing the subject or finding an excuse to leave the room. "What else did Mommy do when she was little?" Tommy asked, settling more comfortably in the small space. "Well," Marcus said, glancing at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly, "she used to build forts out of blankets and pillows, kind of like this hiding place you made. And she loved to sing, especially when she was cooking or cleaning. She said it made the work go faster." "Sarah sings too," Tommy said, looking up at the woman who still held him gently. "She knows the song Mommy used to sing to me before bed." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "She does." Sarah looked embarrassed. "It's just an old lullaby. My mother used to sing it to me when I was small. Can you sing it now?" Tommy asked, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah began to hum softly. The melody was familiar, heartbreakingly so. It was the same song Elena had hummed throughout her pregnancy, the same song she had sung to Tommy every night for the first 2 years of his life. Marcus had forgotten about it completely, had buried the memory along with so many others that were too painful to bear. But hearing it now, in this small secret space with his son relaxed and peaceful between them, he felt something inside him begin to thaw. Not the sharp, desperate grief that had been his constant companion for 2 years, but something gentler, something that felt almost like healing. "Daddy," Tommy said softly when Sarah finished humming, "do you miss Mommy?" The question was so simple, so direct, that Marcus almost couldn't answer. He had spent 2 years avoiding this conversation, deflecting Tommy's questions about his mother, refusing to acknowledge the grief they both carried. "Every single day," he whispered finally. "I miss her every single day." "Me too," Tommy said, and for the first time in months, Marcus saw tears in his son's eyes that weren't born from fear or frustration. "Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like, and that makes me really sad. I have videos of her," Marcus said suddenly, "on my phone, on the computer. Videos of her reading to you, singing to you, playing with you. We could watch them together sometime, if you want." Tommy's face transformed with hope. "Really? You would watch them with me, if you want me to?" "I want that more than anything," Tommy said, and then unexpectedly he launched himself from Sarah's arms into his father's. Marcus caught his son instinctively, holding him close for the first time in months, feeling the warm, solid weight of him, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. Tommy wrapped his arms around Marcus's neck and held on tight, as if he was afraid his father might disappear if he let go. "I love you, Daddy," Tommy whispered against his ear. "Even when you're busy and sad, I still love you so much." Marcus felt tears spill over then, 2 years worth of suppressed grief and guilt and love pouring out of him all at once. "I love you too, buddy. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. I'm sorry I forgot how to show you that." They sat together in the closet for a long time, father and son holding each other, while Sarah watched with tears in her own eyes. Outside, the apartment was quiet, except for the distant sounds of the city far below. Inside their small sanctuary, 3 people who had been carrying too much pain alone began the slow process of learning to carry it together. When they finally emerged from the closet, the late afternoon sun was painting the apartment in shades of gold and amber. Marcus carried Tommy to the living room, settling on the couch with his son still in his arms, reluctant to break the fragile connection they had rebuilt. Sarah gathered her cleaning supplies from the kitchen, preparing to leave them to navigate this new territory together. But as she reached the front door, Marcus called out to her, "Sarah, wait." She turned, her expression cautious. He realized suddenly that she might be expecting to be fired, that his discovery of her in the closet with Tommy could easily be construed as inappropriate or unprofessional. "Thank you," he said simply, "for taking care of him when I couldn't figure out how to take care of myself." Sarah nodded, understanding passing between them. "He's a wonderful little boy, Mr. Thompson. He just needed someone to see that." "Will you?" Marcus started, then stopped, unsure how to ask what he needed to ask. "Would you be willing to stay, not just as a housekeeper, but as part of Tommy's life? I think he needs consistent people around him, people who understand what he's been through. Are you offering me a different position?" Marcus looked down at Tommy, who had fallen asleep again in his arms, one small hand still clutching Mr. Peanuts. "I'm offering you a chance to be part of a family that's trying to figure out how to heal." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus found himself holding his breath, waiting for her answer. He realized suddenly how much he needed her to say yes, not just for Tommy's sake but for his own. She had shown him things about his son that he had been too blind to see, had forced him to confront truths he had been running from for 2 years. "I'd like that," she said finally. "I'd like that very much." As she left that evening, Marcus remained on the couch with Tommy, watching the sun set over Central Park and feeling something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, frantic hope that had carried him through the first months after Elena's death, but something quieter and more sustainable. The hope that came from taking the first step on a very long journey. He looked down at his sleeping son and made a silent promise. No more hiding behind work, no more emotional distance, no more treating Tommy like a reminder of loss instead of a gift to be cherished. They would learn to grieve together, to heal together, to build something new from the ashes of what they had lost. And maybe, just maybe, they would learn to be a family again. Part 3. The New Beginning. 3 weeks had passed since that afternoon in the closet, and the Thompson penthouse had begun to transform in ways that went far deeper than furniture arrangement or interior design. The change was subtle at first, like the gradual shift from winter to spring, barely noticeable day by day, but undeniable when viewed across the span of weeks. Marcus had kept his promise. The very next Monday after their breakthrough, he had cancelled 3 meetings and left work at noon to pick Tommy up from preschool personally. The look of surprise and pure joy on his son's face when Tommy spotted him in the pickup line instead of the usual babysitter had been worth more than any business deal Marcus had ever closed. They had spent that afternoon together in Central Park, just the 2 of them, feeding ducks and playing on the playground equipment, while Marcus remembered what it felt like to see the world through his son's eyes. Tommy had been cautious at first, as if he couldn't quite believe his father was really there, really present, really focused on him instead of checking emails or taking phone calls.
But gradually, as the afternoon wore on, the little boy had begun to relax into the novelty of having his father's undivided attention. "Daddy, watch this," Tommy had called out from the top of the slide, and for the first time in 2 years, Marcus had actually watched. He had put his phone away, ignored the buzzing of notifications, and focused entirely on his son's triumphant descent down the bright red slide. The grin on Tommy's face when he reached the bottom was brighter than any sunrise Marcus had ever seen. That evening, they had ordered pizza and eaten it, sitting on the living room floor, using the coffee table as their dining surface, while Tommy told Marcus elaborate stories about his imaginary friend Captain Whiskers, a talking cat who apparently lived in the kitchen cabinet and only came out when grown-ups weren't looking. Marcus found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in months, not the polite chuckles he produced during business dinners, but real, delighted laughter at his son's creative storytelling. The changes hadn't been dramatic or sudden. Marcus still worked long hours, still traveled occasionally for business, still struggled with the weight of grief that would probably never fully leave him. But now there were new rhythms to their life together, small rituals that began to weave them back into something resembling a family. Every morning before work, Marcus made time to sit with Tommy during breakfast, listening to his son's plans for the day, and sharing his own in terms a 4-year-old could understand. "I have to go talk to some people about building new computer programs," he might say, instead of rushing out the door with a distracted goodbye. "What are you going to do with Miss Sarah today?" The evenings became sacred time. No matter how late Marcus returned from the office, he made a point of spending at least an hour with Tommy before bedtime. Sometimes they read stories together, Marcus gradually remembering how to do the funny voices that used to make Tommy giggle. Sometimes they built elaborate structures with blocks or worked on puzzles, their heads bent together over the dining room table. And sometimes they just talked, Marcus learning to ask questions that invited real answers instead of simple yes or no responses. "What was the best part of your day?" became his standard opening, and Tommy's answers never failed to surprise him. The best part might be discovering a particularly interesting bug on the playground, or successfully tying his own shoes, or the way the sunlight looked different when it came through the kitchen window in the afternoon. Tommy's world was full of small wonders that Marcus had forgotten how to notice, and seeing them through his son's eyes was like discovering a new language of joy. Sarah's role in their household had evolved naturally, though defining it precisely would have been difficult. She was no longer simply the housekeeper, but she wasn't exactly a nanny either. She had become something more essential and harder to categorize, the person who held the emotional center of their small family, while Marcus and Tommy learned how to navigate their relationship. She arrived each morning with a warm smile for Tommy and a gentle check-in for Marcus, sensing somehow whether either of them had experienced a difficult night or needed extra support. She prepared meals that felt like home cooking, rather than mere sustenance, filling the apartment with aromas that made it feel lived in and loved. She created small traditions and celebrations, marking Tommy's minor achievements with homemade cookies or turning rainy afternoons into indoor adventures. Most importantly, she had become the keeper of Elena's memory in a way that felt healing rather than painful. Where Marcus had once flinched away from any mention of his late wife, Sarah had gently encouraged both father and son to share stories, to keep Elena's presence alive in their daily lives, without letting grief consume them. It was Sarah who suggested they create a memory book together, filling it with photographs and stories and little drawings Tommy made of his mother. It was Sarah who helped Marcus set up a small shrine in the living room, not a morbid memorial but a celebration of Elena's life, with fresh flowers and pictures of her laughing, and small objects that had belonged to her. And it was Sarah who, one evening, when Tommy was struggling with a particularly intense wave of missing his mother, had suggested they have a mommy night, where they cooked Elena's favorite meal together, and shared their happiest memories of her. Marcus had been terrified of the idea at first, certain it would be too painful, but Sarah's gentle insistence had convinced him to try. The evening had been a revelation. Instead of drowning in grief, they had found themselves laughing through tears as Tommy told stories about his mother's terrible singing voice, and Marcus shared memories of Elena's disastrous attempts at baking. They had cried, yes, but they had also celebrated, and for the first time since Elena's death, Marcus had felt her presence as a comfort rather than a source of pain. She would be so proud of Tommy, Sarah had said that night, as they cleaned up the dishes together, while Tommy played quietly in the living room. And she would be proud of you too, for learning how to be present with him. Marcus had looked at this woman who had somehow become central to their healing, and felt a complicated tangle of emotions he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Gratitude, certainly. Relief that Tommy had someone who truly understood him. But there was something else too, something that felt dangerously close to dependence, as if Sarah had become essential to their family's functioning in ways that went beyond her official duties. The realization both comforted and unsettled him. What would happen if Sarah decided to leave? What would happen if she found a better job, or met someone and wanted to start her own family? The thought of losing her felt almost as devastating as the thought of losing Elena had once been, and that comparison frightened him. But those fears seemed distant and theoretical as October melted into November, and their new rhythms solidified into something that felt permanent and stable. Tommy was thriving in ways that amazed everyone who knew him.
His preschool teacher commented on how much more confident and social he had become. The pediatrician noted that he was sleeping better and had gained weight. Most importantly, he was laughing again, the kind of uninhibited, joyful laughter that Marcus remembered from before Elena's death. The apartment itself had changed too, in subtle but meaningful ways. Tommy's artwork now covered the refrigerator and several walls, displayed proudly rather than shuffled aside. There were more toys visible in the common areas, evidence of a child who felt free to claim space in his own home. The dining room table was more often covered with puzzles or art projects than business documents, and the kitchen counter usually held evidence of Sarah's cooking rather than stacks of takeout containers. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. His colleagues at work noticed that he seemed more focused during the day, more efficient in his decision-making, more willing to delegate responsibilities rather than micromanaging every detail. He still worked hard, but he no longer used work as an escape from his personal life. Instead, he found himself looking forward to going home, eager to hear about Tommy's day and share dinner as a family. The transformation wasn't lost on his mother, Evelyn, who had been watching from a distance with growing concern for the past 2 years. When she visited for Tommy's birthday in early November, she was amazed by what she found. "I can't believe this is the same apartment," she told Marcus quietly as they stood in the kitchen, watching Sarah help Tommy blow out the candles on his homemade birthday cake. "It feels like a home now." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The sterile perfection that had once characterized the penthouse had given way to something warmer and more alive. There were scuff marks on the walls from Tommy's toys, fingerprints on the windows, the comfortable disorder that came from people actually living in a space rather than simply existing in it. "She's extraordinary," Evelyn continued, nodding toward Sarah, who was now helping Tommy serve cake to his stuffed animals, each of whom apparently had specific preferences about frosting distribution. "Where did you find her?" "She found us," Marcus said, watching his son's face glow with happiness as he conducted an elaborate tea party with his toys. "I don't know what we would have done without her." Evelyn studied her son's face, noting the softness there that had been absent for so long. "Are you happy, Marcus?" The question surprised him. He realized that happiness hadn't been a concept he had considered in relation to himself for a very long time. Survival, yes, functioning certainly, getting through each day without falling apart completely. But happiness, "I think I'm learning how to be," he said finally. "Tommy is happy, and that's what matters most." Tommy's happiness matters, Evelyn agreed. But so does yours. You can't spend the rest of your life just existing for his sake. Elena wouldn't have wanted that for you. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching Sarah and Tommy together. Sarah was currently pretending to be deeply concerned about Mr. Peanut's apparent dissatisfaction with his piece of cake, discussing the elephant's dietary preferences with the kind of serious attention that made Tommy dissolve into giggles. I don't know how to want things for myself anymore, Marcus admitted. For 2 years all I've wanted is to not hurt. And now that the pain isn't quite so sharp, I don't know what comes next. Maybe you start by admitting that you care about her, Evelyn said gently. Marcus felt heat rise in his face. She works for us, Mom. She's Tommy's caregiver. She's a woman who has brought your family back to life, and you'd be a fool not to recognize what that means. Before Marcus could respond, Tommy came running over, his face smeared with chocolate frosting and his eyes bright with excitement. Daddy, Sarah says if it stops raining tomorrow, we can go to the zoo and see the penguins. Can we? Please, can we? Marcus looked down at his son, this little boy who was asking for something as simple as a trip to the zoo with the same enthusiasm another child might reserve for a trip to Disney World, and felt his heart expand with love and gratitude. Of course we can go to the zoo, he said, lifting Tommy into his arms. We'll make a whole day of it. Sarah too? Tommy asked, as if it were impossible to imagine such an adventure without her. Sarah too, Marcus confirmed, catching her eye over Tommy's head and seeing the warmth in her smile. The zoo trip became the first of many family outings that blurred the lines between employer and employee, between professional duty and personal affection. They went to museums and parks, to children's theater performances and art classes. Sarah was no longer just accompanying them. She was participating, contributing ideas, sharing in the joy of Tommy's discoveries and the gradual rebuilding of Marcus's relationship with his son. And somewhere in the midst of these shared experiences, Marcus began to realize that his feelings for Sarah had evolved beyond gratitude or professional appreciation. He found himself looking forward to her arrival each morning, not just because of what she did for Tommy, but because of the way her presence brightened the entire apartment. He noticed the way she hummed while she worked, the way she always had a ready smile for both of them, the way she seemed to find genuine joy in the small moments that made up their daily life. More than that, he began to notice Sarah as a woman rather than just a caregiver. The way her eyes crinkled when she laughed at Tommy's stories. The way she moved through their kitchen with quiet efficiency, creating meals that felt like love made tangible. The way she listened when Marcus talked about his work or his worries, offering insights that were both practical and compassionate. He began to understand that Sarah wasn't just helping them heal from their loss, she was becoming essential to their future happiness. And that realization terrified him, almost as much as it thrilled him. The breakthrough came on a snowy evening in late November, when Tommy came down with a sudden fever that spiked high enough to warrant a trip to the emergency room. Marcus had been in a client dinner when Sarah called, her voice calm but urgent. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Tommy's temperature is 103, and I can't get it to come down. I think we need to get him to a doctor." Marcus left the restaurant immediately, not caring about the million-dollar deal he was walking away from, caring only about getting to his son. He found Sarah in the apartment's lobby, Tommy wrapped in blankets in her arms, the little boy flushed and listless with fever. The next several hours blurred together in the fluorescent-lit chaos of the pediatric emergency room. Tests and x-rays and worried consultations with doctors who ultimately determined that Tommy had a severe case of flu that would require careful monitoring but wasn't life-threatening. Through it all, Sarah never left their side, holding Tommy when he cried, advocating for him with the medical staff, providing the kind of steady, comforting presence that Marcus felt too panicked to offer. It wasn't until Tommy was finally settled in a hospital bed for overnight observation, his fever broken and his breathing easier, that Marcus realized how completely Sarah had stepped into the role of co-parent during the crisis.
She hadn't asked permission or waited for direction. She had simply done what needed to be done, making decisions and taking action with the kind of instinctive protectiveness that came from genuine love. "Thank you," he said quietly as they sat beside Tommy's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his son's chest. "I don't know what I would have done without you tonight." "You would have done exactly what any parent would do," Sarah replied. "You would have taken care of your son, but I wasn't here when it started. You were. You're always here when we need you most." Sarah looked at him thoughtfully, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression, a recognition of the deeper meaning behind his words. "Being here isn't a burden for me, Marcus," she said softly. "Caring for Tommy, being part of your family, it's become the most important thing in my life." Thompson, the acknowledgement that they had become a family, rather than just an employer and employee, all of it hung in the air between them like a bridge that one of them would have to choose to cross. "Sarah," Marcus began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate what he was feeling. "I know," she said gently. "I know this is complicated. I know there are boundaries we've crossed that probably make things difficult, but I need you to know that everything I've done, everything I've felt, it's been real. This isn't just a job for me anymore." Marcus reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, feeling the calluses from years of hard work, the strength that had held his family together when he couldn't. "It's not just a job for me either," he said. "You've given us our lives back, Sarah. You've taught me how to be a father again, how to see joy in ordinary moments. You've made us a family." Tommy stirred in his sleep, making a small sound of contentment that suggested his dreams were peaceful, despite the sterile hospital environment. Both adults looked at him, this little boy who had brought them together, who had been the catalyst for healing they both desperately needed. "What happens now?" Sarah asked quietly. Marcus considered the question, thinking about all the conventional reasons why what he was feeling might be inappropriate or inadvisable. She worked for him, which created an inherent power imbalance. They came from different worlds, different economic circumstances. He was still grieving his late wife, still learning how to be whole again. There were a dozen rational arguments against what his heart was telling him. But as he sat there holding Sarah's hand beside his son's hospital bed, Marcus realized that rationality had very little to do with love. Love was what Sarah had shown Tommy when she held him in that closet. Love was what had motivated her to stay late countless evenings, to worry about their well-being, to invest her heart in their healing. Love was what he felt when he watched her with his son, when he came home to the warmth she had created in their apartment, when he imagined a future that included her not as an employee but as a partner. "I think what happens now is that we stop pretending this is just about work," he said finally. "I think we acknowledge that we've become something more than employer and employee, something more than even friends. I think we talk about what it might mean to build a real future together." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel like you have to." "I don't feel like I have to do anything," Marcus interrupted. "I feel like I want to. For the first time in 2 years, I want something for myself beyond just getting through each day. I want a life with you and Tommy. I want us to be a real family." In the quiet of the hospital room, with machines beeping softly, and the distant sounds of the night shift going about their duties, Marcus and Sarah began to plan a future that neither of them had dared to imagine just hours earlier. They talked about practical things, how to navigate the transition from employer-employee to romantic partners, how to explain the change to Tommy, how to handle the inevitable gossip and judgment from people who wouldn't understand their unconventional beginning. But mostly they talked about dreams. Sarah's quiet hope for a family of her own, after years of sacrificing her personal desires for her brother's needs. Marcus's growing desire to create something new and beautiful from the ashes of his grief. Their shared vision of giving Tommy the kind of stable, loving home that would help him flourish into the remarkable person they both knew he could become. When Tommy woke the next morning, his fever completely gone and his energy already returning, he found his father and Sarah sitting close together beside his bed, their hands intertwined, their faces glowing with a happiness that was unmistakable even to a 4-year-old. "Are you holding hands?" Tommy asked with the directness that only children possessed. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances, and Sarah nodded encouragingly. "Yes, buddy, we are," Marcus said. "How do you feel about that?" Tommy considered this information with the seriousness of a philosopher contemplating the universe's greatest mysteries. Then his face broke into a grin that could have powered the entire hospital. "Does this mean Sarah gets to stay forever?" he asked. "If she wants to," Marcus replied, looking at Sarah with a question in his eyes. "I want to," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to stay forever." Tommy clapped his hands together with delight, apparently considering this the best possible outcome to his hospital adventure. "Can we tell Mr. Peanuts? He's going to be so excited." And so it was that the Thompson family was officially born not in a church or a courthouse, but in a pediatric hospital room, with a stuffed elephant as their first witness and the beeping of medical equipment as their wedding music. It wasn't the conventional beginning that any of them might have imagined, but it was perfect in its own way, a testament to the fact that families are created not by biology or law, but by love and choice and the daily decision to show up for each other. The months that followed were filled with the ordinary magic of a family learning how to be together. Sarah moved into the penthouse officially, her small studio apartment in Queens replaced by a real home with people who loved her. David, her brother, was overjoyed to see his sister finally putting her own happiness first, and he became a regular visitor to the apartment, bringing his pre-med textbooks and studying at their dining room table, while Tommy helped by offering advice on anatomy from his picture books. Marcus formally proposed on a spring evening 6 months later, not with an elaborate romantic gesture, but with a simple question asked while they were doing dishes together after dinner, Tommy playing contentedly on the kitchen floor with his blocks. Sarah said yes through tears of joy, and Tommy insisted that Mr. Peanuts should be the ring bearer at their wedding, a suggestion that was seriously considered and ultimately accepted. They were married in the apartment's living room on a sunny Saturday morning, with Tommy as the ring bearer, David as Marcus's best man, and Evelyn as Sarah's matron of honor. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended only by the people who had witnessed their journey from brokenness to wholeness.
But it was filled with more joy and meaning than the most elaborate society wedding could have contained. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever challenges life might bring, Marcus looked at his new wife and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years earlier, he had been a man drowning in grief, unable to connect with his own son, living in an apartment that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Now he was surrounded by love, married to a woman who had taught him how to hope again, watching his son flourish in the security of a family that had been forged through choice rather than obligation. The apartment buzzed with life and laughter, filled with the comfortable chaos that came from people who genuinely enjoyed being together. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility. There would be challenges, certainly. The process of blending their different backgrounds and experiences into a cohesive family unit would require patience and compromise. Marcus's demanding career would continue to create pressure on their family time. Sarah's brother David would need ongoing support as he worked toward his dream of becoming a doctor. Tommy would grow and change, requiring different kinds of attention and guidance as he navigated childhood and eventually adolescence. But they would face those challenges together, as a team, as a family. They had already proven that love could triumph over loss, that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds, that sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones that came together, not by accident but by design. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of their home, casting everything in golden light, Marcus pulled his new wife close and kissed her while their son cheered and Mr. Peanuts presided over the celebration with his usual dignity.
Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, millions of people pursuing their own dreams and struggling with their own challenges. But inside the Thompson penthouse, three people who had found each other across the vast spaces of loss and longing were beginning the next chapter of their story, secure in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. They were no longer three separate individuals trying to survive their respective traumas. They were a family bound together by love and choice, and the daily miracle of showing up for each other. And in the end, that was everything. 5 years had passed since that transformative day in the closet, and the Thompson family had grown in ways that none of them could have imagined during those dark months when grief and isolation had threatened to tear them apart forever. The penthouse that had once felt like a beautiful prison had become a sanctuary of warmth and laughter, a place where love lived in every corner and memories were treasured rather than feared. Tommy was now 9 years old, tall for his age with his father's thoughtful eyes and his mother Elena's quick smile. He had grown into a confident, curious child who approached the world with the kind of fearless enthusiasm that came from knowing he was unconditionally loved and supported. The scared little boy who had once hidden in closets had been replaced by a young man who spoke up in class, made friends easily, and possessed an infectious laugh that could brighten even the darkest days. He excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and science, showing an analytical mind that reminded Marcus of his own childhood fascination with problem-solving and logical thinking. But Tommy also had inherited his mother's creative streak, spending hours drawing elaborate comic strips featuring Captain Whiskers, the imaginary cat who had now evolved into the hero of dozens of adventures that Tommy wrote and illustrated with meticulous care. The relationship between Tommy and Marcus had deepened into something neither of them had thought possible during those painful months after Elena's death. They were not just father and son now, they were genuine friends who enjoyed each other's company and shared interests that went far beyond the basic obligations of family life. Marcus had learned to see the world through his son's eyes again, finding wonder in things he had forgotten to notice, the way shadows moved across their living room floor throughout the day, the intricate patterns that frost made on windows during winter mornings, the complex social dynamics of the pigeons that gathered on their balcony each afternoon. Their Saturday mornings had become sacred time, devoted to whatever adventure struck Tommy's fancy. Sometimes they would explore different neighborhoods in the city, hunting for the best bagels or the most interesting bookstores. Other Saturdays found them in Central Park, Tommy teaching his father increasingly sophisticated strategies for their ongoing chess matches while they sat on park benches and watched the seasons change around them. Marcus had discovered that his son was becoming quite the strategist, capable of thinking several moves ahead and setting elaborate traps that often caught his father off guard. But perhaps the most precious tradition they had developed was their evening ritual of what Tommy called memory sharing. Each night before bed, they would sit together in Tommy's room and take turns sharing a favorite memory from the day, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Tommy might talk about the funny way his friend Jackson had mispronounced a word during reading time, or the interesting cloud formation he had noticed during recess. Marcus would share moments from his own day, a successful presentation at work, an amusing conversation with a colleague, or simply the satisfaction of solving a particularly complex problem. These conversations had taught Marcus the profound difference between listening and truly hearing. During those lost years after Elena's death, he had gone through the motions of parental communication without really absorbing what his son was trying to tell him. Now he understood that Tommy's seemingly random observations and stories were actually windows into a rich inner life that was constantly growing and evolving. Every day brought new discoveries, new questions, new ways of understanding the world, and Marcus had learned to treasure his role as witness to his son's unfolding journey toward adulthood. Sarah had blossomed in their family environment in ways that continuously amazed everyone who knew her. The tired, stressed woman who had once worked 3 jobs to keep herself and her brother afloat had been replaced by someone who radiated contentment and purpose. She had found her calling in nurturing their family, but she had also discovered talents and interests that had been buried under years of survival mode. She had enrolled in evening classes at a local community college, initially just to satisfy her own curiosity about subjects she had never had time to explore. But her natural intelligence and years of life experience had made her an exceptional student, and she was now just one semester away from completing her degree in early childhood development. Her professors had consistently praised her insight into child psychology and her ability to create learning environments that felt both structured and nurturing. The irony was not lost on any of them that Sarah, who had started as their housekeeper, was now pursuing a career that would allow her to help other families navigate the challenges of raising children in an increasingly complex world. Marcus had watched with pride as she presented her research projects, articulating complex theories about child development with the kind of practical wisdom that could only come from real-world experience. Her relationship with her brother David had also evolved beautifully as their circumstances improved. David was now in his final year of medical school, specializing in pediatric oncology with the kind of passionate dedication that reminded everyone of why he had dreamed of becoming a doctor in the first place. The financial pressure that had once threatened to derail his education had been lifted when Marcus quietly arranged for David's remaining tuition to be covered, not as charity but as an investment in someone who was already family. David had initially resisted accepting help, his pride struggling against the practical reality of his situation. But Sarah had convinced him that allowing people who loved him to support his dreams was not a sign of weakness but an acknowledgement of the interconnectedness that made families strong. Now David spent most Sunday afternoons at the penthouse, studying at their dining room table while Tommy peppered him with questions about the human body, and Sarah prepared elaborate meals that sent him back to his tiny apartment with enough leftovers to last the week. The dynamic between Marcus and Sarah had deepened into the kind of partnership that made other couples envious. They had learned to navigate the complexities of their unusual beginning, moving from employer and employee to husband and wife with a grace that surprised even them. Their love had grown from mutual respect and shared purpose into something that felt both passionate and enduring, based on the solid foundation of having seen each other at their worst and choosing to stay anyway. Marcus had discovered that Sarah possessed a sharp business mind that had been hidden under years of economic necessity. She had opinions about his work that were both insightful and practical, and he had gradually begun involving her in decisions that went far beyond the domestic sphere. Her perspective on employee relations, shaped by her own experience as someone who had worked multiple service jobs, had helped him implement policies at his company that improved both productivity and worker satisfaction. More importantly, Sarah had taught him the difference between providing for a family and being present with them. During his first marriage to Elena, Marcus realized now he had often fallen into the trap of thinking that working long hours was the primary way to show love. Elena had tried to tell him that she valued his time more than his paycheck, but he had been too caught up in the competitive culture of his industry to really hear what she was saying. Sarah's influence had helped him restructure his priorities in ways that actually made him more successful professionally, not less. By being more focused during work hours and more present during family time, he found that he made better decisions, maintained stronger relationships with clients, and felt more satisfied with his career achievements. The frantic urgency that had once characterized his approach to business had been replaced by a calm confidence that came from knowing what truly mattered. Their marriage had been blessed with new additions that filled their home with even more joy and chaos. Sarah had given birth to twins 18 months after their wedding, a boy named Daniel and a girl named Emma. The pregnancy had been unexpected but welcomed with celebration, and the arrival of the babies had transformed their family dynamic in beautiful and complicated ways. Tommy had embraced his role as big brother with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. He took his responsibilities seriously. helping with feeding schedules, entertaining the babies when they were fussy, and providing a running commentary on their development that often made the adults laugh until they cried. "Emma is definitely going to be left-handed like Uncle David," he would announce with authority after watching her reach for toys. "And Daniel has the same thinking face that Dad makes when he's working on hard problems." The twins were now 3 years old, and their personalities had emerged in ways that kept everyone constantly entertained. Daniel had inherited his father's methodical approach to problem-solving, spending long periods arranging blocks in precise patterns or working on puzzles with the kind of focused concentration usually seen in much older children.
Emma was more like her mother Sarah, observant and intuitive, quick to comfort other children when they were upset, and possessed of an uncanny ability to sense when adults were worried about something. The apartment had been renovated to accommodate their growing family, with a nursery that converted into a playroom as the twins outgrew their cribs, and Tommy's room expanded to include a study area where he could work on homework without being disturbed by toddler chaos. But more than the physical changes, the emotional landscape of their home had been transformed by the addition of Daniel and Emma. Marcus had approached fatherhood differently the second time around, determined not to repeat the mistakes he had made during Tommy's early years. He was present for middle-of-the-night feedings, actively involved in potty training negotiations, and committed to being the kind of father who showed up for every milestone, no matter how small. Watching his younger children grow while simultaneously deepening his relationship with Tommy had given him a profound appreciation for the fleeting nature of childhood and the importance of treasuring each stage as it came. Sarah had proven to be a natural mother, approaching the challenges of raising twins with the same calm competence she brought to everything else in their lives. She had an intuitive understanding of each child's unique needs and temperament, somehow managing to provide individual attention to Daniel and Emma while never making Tommy feel displaced or forgotten. The juggling act of managing 3 children, continuing her education, and maintaining their household would have overwhelmed many people, but Sarah seemed to thrive on the organized chaos that had become their daily rhythm. One of the most beautiful developments in their family story had been the gradual healing of the grief that had once threatened to destroy them all. Elena's memory had found its proper place in their lives, honored and cherished, but no longer a source of pain that prevented them from embracing the present. Tommy talked about his first mother easily now, sharing memories and asking questions about her life with the comfortable curiosity of a child who knew that loving Elena didn't diminish his love for Sarah, and vice versa. Marcus had learned to speak Elena's name without the crushing weight of guilt and regret that had once accompanied any mention of his late wife. Sarah had helped him understand that grief was not something to be conquered or overcome, but rather integrated into the larger story of their lives. Elena would always be part of their family history, the woman who had given birth to Tommy, and whose love had shaped Marcus into the man capable of opening his heart again. The memory corner they had created in their living room had evolved over the years into something that felt celebratory rather than mournful. Fresh flowers appeared there weekly, along with small treasures that Tommy found and wanted to share with his first mother. Interesting rocks from their trips to the park, drawings he was particularly proud of, school photographs that marked his growth from a sad little boy into a confident young man. During holiday celebrations and family milestones, they had developed traditions that included Elena's presence in natural, comfortable ways. Tommy would tell the twins stories about their brother's first mother, describing her laugh and her terrible singing voice, and her talent for making ordinary days feel special. Daniel and Emma had grown up knowing Elena as a beloved figure in their family history, someone who was part of their story, even though they had never met her. The transformation in Marcus was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The cold, distant man who had once hidden behind work and emotional walls had become someone who led with his heart, who found joy in small moments, who had learned that vulnerability was not weakness but the foundation of authentic connection. His colleagues at work noticed the change, commenting on his improved leadership style and his ability to inspire loyalty in his employees.
He had implemented family-friendly policies at his company that reflected his own hard-won understanding of the importance of work-life balance. Generous parental leave, flexible scheduling options, and on-site childcare had not only improved employee satisfaction, but had also enhanced the company's reputation and bottom line. Marcus had become living proof that success in business did not require sacrificing success in family life. The annual Thompson Foundation Gala had become one of the most anticipated charity events in New York, raising millions of dollars for organizations that supported grieving families and children who had lost parents. The foundation, established in Elena's memory, provided counseling services, financial assistance, and educational opportunities for families navigating the complex challenges of loss and healing. Sarah had become heavily involved in the foundation's work, using her own experience of loss and recovery to help design programs that actually met the needs of grieving families. Her insight into the practical challenges of single parenthood and economic hardship had shaped initiatives that went beyond traditional grief counseling to address the real-world obstacles that often prevented families from accessing the help they needed. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the Foundation's work was the scholarship program they had established for young adults who had overcome significant adversity to pursue higher education. David had been one of their first scholarship recipients, and seeing him graduate from medical school and begin his residency had inspired Marcus and Sarah to expand the program dramatically. Every year they hosted a scholarship dinner where recipients shared their stories of resilience and determination. These events had become profound reminders of the power of hope and the importance of investing in people who had proven their strength through survival. Marcus often found himself moved to tears listening to young people describe their journeys from hardship to opportunity, seeing reflections of Sarah's own story in their struggles and triumphs. The ripple effects of their family's healing had extended far beyond their own household. Tommy's confidence and emotional intelligence had made him a natural leader among his classmates, someone other children turned to when they needed help or comfort. His teachers frequently commented on his unusual maturity and empathy, qualities that had been forged through his early experience with loss but refined through years of unconditional love and support. Marcus had become a mentor to other widowed fathers, sharing his hard-won wisdom about the importance of seeking help and remaining open to unexpected sources of healing. He spoke regularly at grief support groups, telling his story not as someone who had conquered loss but as someone who had learned to live alongside it in healthy ways. Sarah's work with the foundation had led to opportunities to speak at conferences about child development and family resilience. Her unique perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of the service relationship had made her a sought-after consultant for organizations working with vulnerable families. As their 5th wedding anniversary approached, Marcus found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. 5 years earlier, he had been a man drowning in grief and guilt, unable to connect with his own son and living in an apartment that felt more like a museum than a home. Sarah had been a woman working multiple jobs to support her brother's dreams while sacrificing her own hopes for the future. Tommy had been a frightened little boy hiding in closets because the world felt too big and too painful to navigate safely. The twins, of course, had existed only as distant possibilities, unimaginable additions to a family that hadn't yet learned how to function as a unit. Now their home was filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. Homework spread across the dining room table, toys scattered in corners, the lingering sense of Sarah's cooking mixing with the sounds of children's laughter and conversation. The walls were covered with artwork created by small hands, photographs documenting countless family adventures, and the accumulated evidence of lives fully lived and deeply interconnected. The transformation was visible in ways both large and small. Marcus no longer worked 16-hour days or checked email during family dinners. Sarah had learned to accept help and support without feeling guilty about her own needs and desires. Tommy had grown from a boy who was afraid to take up space into a young man who spoke with confidence about his dreams for the future.
Most importantly, they had all learned that love was not a finite resource that diminished when shared, but rather something that multiplied when given freely. The love that Marcus had once hoarded out of fear of being hurt again had expanded to encompass not just Sarah and the twins, but David, the scholarship recipients, the families served by their foundation, and countless others whose lives had been touched by their story of healing and hope. As they planned their anniversary celebration, Marcus and Sarah decided to return to the place where their story had truly begun, Tommy's closet. The space that had once been a hiding place for a frightened child had been transformed over the years into a reading nook, with comfortable cushions and soft lighting that invited quiet contemplation rather than fearful retreat. On the morning of their anniversary, the entire family gathered in that small space that had witnessed their first breakthrough. Tommy, now too tall to fit comfortably in the corner where he had once curled up with Mr. Peanuts, sat cross-legged on the floor while Daniel and Emma nestled in their parents' arms. "Tell us the story again," Emma requested, her favorite phrase for any tale that had been shared more than once. Tommy, who had become the family's unofficial historian, launched into his version of how Daddy and Sarah had fallen in love. His telling emphasized the dramatic elements that appealed to his 9-year-old sensibilities: the day he was sick and had to go to the hospital, the way Daddy used to be sad all the time but got better when Sarah started making them a real family, the moment when they realized they wanted to be together forever. "And then you got married and had us," Daniel added, not wanting to be left out of the narrative. "And then we all lived happily ever after," Emma concluded with satisfaction. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances over their children's heads, both thinking the same thing, that happiness was not actually an ending but a daily choice, a commitment to showing up for each other through whatever challenges and joys life might bring. As they sat together in that transformed space, surrounded by the family they had built from the ashes of loss and the foundations of love, Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude for the circuitous path that had led them to this moment. The pain they had endured, the mistakes they had made, the courage they had found to remain open to connection despite the risk of future loss, all of it had been necessary to create the life they now shared. Tommy would grow up and leave for college in less than a decade, pursuing his own dreams and creating his own version of family. Daniel and Emma would follow their own paths, carrying with them the security and confidence that came from knowing they were unconditionally loved. Sarah would finish her degree and perhaps pursue graduate studies, continuing to build on the foundation they had created together. Marcus himself would keep growing and changing, shaped by the daily practice of being present with the people he loved most. There would be new challenges, unexpected losses, moments of doubt and fear and uncertainty, but they would face all of it together, as a family that had proven its strength through adversity and its capacity for joy through choice. The closet that had once hidden a frightened child now held a family that embodied everything worthwhile about the human capacity for healing, growth, and love. They were living proof that even the most painful circumstances could become the foundation for something beautiful, that broken hearts could mend stronger than before, and that the most meaningful families were often the ones that chose each other again and again, day by day, year by year, creating love through the simple act of refusing to give up on each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.